In the basement archives of the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology, under catalogue number CBS 15167, sits a fragment of clay smaller than a human hand. It was excavated from Nippur in 1893 and shelved as a funerary incantation, incomplete. For over a century, no one questioned that label. In 2014, a graduate student re-examining Nippur liturgical fragments noticed the text did not read as incantation, it read as instruction. The fragment described in sequential order what happens to the spirit in the moments immediately after the body fails. Not what to pray, what to expect. The students' findings were never published. The Sumerian word for the spirit of the dead was Gidim. In Akkadian, the language that gradually replaced Sumerian across Mesopotamia, the same concept was called a temmu. It did not mean soul in the way modern religions use that word. It meant something closer to a residue, the part of a person that remains after the body has stopped functioning, carrying memory, identity and need. The Sumerians did not debate whether this residue existed. They legislated around it. They fed it. They built infrastructure to manage it. And they recorded, across hundreds of tablets spanning more than 1,000 years, what they believed happened to it in the immediate aftermath of death. No single surviving Sumerian tablet contains the phrase 7 minutes after death. That framing is modern, borrowed from contemporary near-death experience research that measures brain activity in the minutes following cardiac arrest. But the premise is not fabricated from nothing. The Sumerians describe death not as an instant, but as a process with sequence and duration. The Gidim did not vanish, it transitioned, and the scribes who recorded that transition wrote it in procedural terms, as though documenting stages that could be observed, anticipated and prepared for. The god most associated with this threshold was Enki. Known as Ereshkigal in later Akkadian texts, Enki was the god of fresh water, wisdom, craft, and the subterranean aquifer called the Abzu. He was not a death god. He was something more unusual in the Sumerian pantheon. He was the god who intervened at boundaries. When the goddess Inanna descended into the underworld and was killed by her sister Ereshkigal, it was Enki who devised the means of her recovery. He fashioned two beings, the Kurgaru and the Galaturu, from the dirt beneath his fingernails. Small enough to slip through the gates of the underworld undetected, he sent them carrying the food and water of life. Inanna was restored. No other god attempted a rescue. No other god understood the mechanism well enough to try. In the Atrahasis epic, one of the oldest narrative texts in human history, Enki again operates at the border between existence and non-existence. When the gods decide to destroy humanity with a flood, it is Enki who warns the survivor, speaking not directly but through a reed wall, technically obeying the divine decree while subverting it entirely. He is the god of loopholes in the laws of mortality. He understands death not as an absolute but as a system with rules, and rules in Enki's view can be navigated. This matters because the texts describing what happens to the Gidim after death are not random folklore. They exist within a theological framework in which the boundary between life and death was understood as a governed space, administered, structured and presided over by specific divine authorities. The Gidim did not float into abstraction. It went somewhere. The Sumerians called that place Kur. Later texts called it Ereshkigal. It sat below the surface of the earth, beneath the Abzu, beneath the fresh water, in a region no living person could reach except under extraordinary divine intervention. And the journey to reach it was not instantaneous. The most detailed surviving account of that journey comes from a composition known today as Inanna's Descent to the Underworld, preserved on tablets from Nippur, and several smaller sites across southern Iraq. The text describes 7 gates. At each gate, the traveller is stopped. At each gate, something is removed. Inanna enters wearing the crown of the steppe, the rod and line of authority, lapis lazuli beads, a breastplate, a gold ring, and a royal robe. At each of the 7 gates, one item is taken. By the time she reaches the throne room of Ereshkigal, she is naked. Stripped of every marker of identity, rank, and power. The underworld does not care who you were. It removes what you carried and presents you as what you are. Scholars have debated whether this stripping was understood as literal or metaphorical. The answer, based on the broader Sumerian textual record, appears to be both. The physical grave goods buried with the dead, the jewellery, the weapons, the cups of water and plates of bread, were not symbolic gestures. They were provisions. The Gidim needed them for the passage. The offerings left by the living at the graveside in the months and years after burial were not memorials, they were sustenance. The Sumerians believed the dead could go hungry, they believed the dead could suffer thirst, and they believed that a Gidim denied these provisions did not simply fade, it turned. The word for this turning was different depending on the text, but the function was consistent across the corpus. An unburied or unfed Gidim became dangerous. It returned to the world of the living not as a ghost in the Western literary sense, transparent and mournful, but as an agent of illness, misfortune, and psychological torment. Sumerian medical texts, the same tablets used by practitioners who treated fevers and infections, list the Gidim as a cause of disease. The treatment was not medicine, it was ritual. Offerings to the dead, restoration of funerary rites, appeasement of the spirit that had been neglected. This was not fringe belief, it was civic infrastructure. The care of the dead was administered at the household level and enforced at the institutional level. Temples maintained calendars of offering dates. Families who failed to feed their dead were understood to be endangering not only themselves but their neighbours. The boundary between the living and the dead, in Sumerian thought, was not a wall, it was a membrane. And what passed through it depended entirely on whether the living held up their end of an obligation they did not choose but could not safely ignore. Ereshkigal ruled the underworld not because she chose it, but because she was assigned it. In the Sumerian cosmological texts, when the domains of the universe were divided among the gods, An took the heavens, Enlil took the earth and its atmosphere, Enki took the subterranean waters, and Ereshkigal was given Kur, the land below everything else. She did not conquer it. She was sent there, and once she arrived, she could not leave. The Queen of the Dead was herself a prisoner of her own kingdom, bound to it by the same laws that bound the spirit she governed. This detail matters because it reveals something about how the Sumerians understood the underworld's authority. It was not malevolent, it was structural. Ereshkigal did not punish the dead out of cruelty. She administered a system older than her own reign, one she inherited and could not alter. When Inanna arrived in the throne room stripped of everything, Ereshkigal did not gloat. She followed procedure. The Anunnaki, the great judges of the underworld, were convened. They fixed their eyes upon Inanna. The phrase the text uses is the eyes of death. Judgment was rendered. Inanna was struck dead and hung on a hook on the wall. The process was bureaucratic, the result was absolute. The Anunnaki who served as underworld judges were not the same Anunnaki referenced in celestial contexts. Sumerian theology distinguished between gods of the upper world and gods of the lower. The 7 judges who sat before Ereshkigal were chthonic deities whose function was singular. They assessed the dead. The surviving texts do not describe a moral evaluation in the way later religions would develop it. No weighing of sins against virtues, no celestial ledger. The judgment appears to have been procedural. Were the rites performed? Were the offerings made? Was the body buried? Was the name spoken? The criteria were not ethical. They were contractual. Nergal's place in this system came later, narratively and theologically. The text known as Nergal and Ereshkigal, preserved in both an older Sumerian version and a longer Akkadian recension from the Library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh, describes how a god of war and plague descended to the underworld, threatened Ereshkigal, and ultimately became her consort and co-ruler. The story is remarkable because it shows even a god submitting to the underworld's authority. Nergal entered Kur with the intent to dominate it. He ended by joining it. The gravitational pull of death in Sumerian thought was stronger than divine violence. The 12th tablet of the Epic of Gilgamesh contains the most explicit surviving description of what existence in the underworld looked like for ordinary human dead. Enkidu's shade, summoned through a hole in the earth by the intervention of Enki, describes to Gilgamesh what he has seen below. The account is not dramatic, it is administrative and grey. The dead sit in darkness, they eat dust and clay. Their status in the underworld corresponds directly to their burial conditions. The man with one son fares differently from the man with 5 sons. The unburied corpse lies in the street of the underworld with no rest. The stillborn child plays at a table of gold and silver, the only figure in the entire account who is described with anything resembling comfort. Every other shade exists in graduated states of deprivation, ranked not by moral conduct but by the material and ritual investment the living made in their death. This is the passage that makes the Sumerian afterlife so uncomfortable for modern readers. There is no redemption arc. There is no paradise for the righteous. There is a grey space governed by rules that have nothing to do with how a person lived and everything to do with how they were buried. The quality of your eternity depended on your survivors. If they fed your Gidim, you endured. If they forgot, you suffered. If you had no one to remember you, your existence was the worst the scribes could describe. The Sumerians did not promise justice after death. They promised continuation, and continuation had terms. The Atrahasis epic adds a layer beneath even this. In the creation account preserved on Old Babylonian tablets dating to approximately 1700 BCE, humans are not created from clay alone. They are made from clay mixed with the flesh and blood of a slaughtered god named Wailer, sometimes rendered Geshtue, a deity of intelligence who was killed specifically so that his divine essence could be folded into the human form. The text is explicit about what this means. The Atemmu, the spirit that persists after death, is not a human invention. It is the fragment of the two. It is the piece of Wailer that was never meant to die and therefore cannot. When a human body fails, the Atemmu does not disappear because it was never fully mortal to begin with. Death, in this framework, is not the end of a life. It is the separation of the mortal clay from the immortal residue that was pressed into it at the moment of creation. Gilgamesh understood this. The entire arc of the epic, the oldest long-form narrative in the written record, is a man confronting the fact that death cannot be outrun. After Enkidu dies, Gilgamesh crosses the waters of death, finds Utnapishtim, the one human granted immortality, and fails every test placed before him. He cannot stay awake for 6 days. He loses the plant of youth to a serpent. He returns to Uruk empty-handed, with nothing but the walls of his city to show for a life spent refusing to accept what the gods designed into him from the start. Death is not an accident in Sumerian thought. It is architecture, and the texts that describe what happens after it are not speculations. They are, in the scribe's understanding, engineering documents for a system that every human being will enter. Modern near-death experience research, beginning with Raymond Moody's work in 1975 and expanding through the studies of Pim van Lommel, Sam Parnia, and the AWARE trials at the University of Southampton, has produced a recurring catalogue of reported phenomena. Patients who have been clinically dead and resuscitated describe with remarkable consistency across cultures and decades a sequence of experiences. A sensation of leaving the body, movement through a dark space often described as a tunnel, an encounter with light, a presence or presences, sometimes identified as deceased relatives, sometimes as figures of authority, a sense of judgment or life review, and a boundary, a threshold beyond which the person understands they cannot pass and return. The reports are not uniform in every detail, but the structural architecture repeats. Separation from the body, a passage, a stripping away of the familiar, an encounter with figures who assess, a point of no return. The Sumerian account follows the same sequence. The Gidim separates from the body. It travels downward through a space the living cannot see. It passes through gates where everything carried from life is removed. It arrives before judges who assess not character but compliance with the system, and the boundary is absolute. What enters Kur does not come back. Two frameworks separated by more than 4,000 years describe, in structurally parallel terms, a transition that follows the same procedural order. Separation, passage, stripping, judgment, permanence. These are not the same claims. The Sumerians were recording theology. Modern NDE researchers are recording subjective reports under controlled clinical conditions. The language is different. The epistemology is different. The Sumerian scribe was not measuring oxygen levels in the brain. The cardiologist in Southampton is not invoking Ereshkigal, but both are describing a process, not an event. Both treat death as something that unfolds in stages rather than arriving all at once, and both place at the centre of that process a moment where identity is assessed by something other than the self. The parallels may be coincidence. They may be the product of a dying brain generating narrative from its own cultural vocabulary. Sumerians seeing gates because they lived in walled cities, modern patients seeing tunnels because they grew up with highways and hospitals. The neurological explanation is coherent and well supported. Oxygen deprivation produces visual narrowing, endorphin release produces calm, temporal lobe activity produces the sense of presence. Every individual element of the near-death experience has a plausible biological correlate. The ordinary explanations are probably correct. But the Sumerians were not asking what each element meant on its own. They were asking why the same structure appeared every time, why the sequence repeated, why the dead, when they could be contacted through ritual, to describe the same passage in the same order, across generations, across cities, across centuries of recorded observation. They did not have EEGs, they did not have fMRI machines. They had thousands of years of watching people die, burying them, feeding their spirits, and recording what the spirits reported when summoned. And the structure they documented is the same one showing up in cardiac arrest wards in the 21st century. An estimated 500,000 cuneiform tablets survive in museum collections worldwide. They sit in the British Museum, the University of Pennsylvania, the Iraq Museum, the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin, the Louvre, the Yale Babylonian Collection, and dozens of smaller institutional holdings across Europe, North America, and the Middle East. The majority have never been fully translated. Sumerology is one of the smallest academic disciplines in the world. Funding is scarce, positions are fewer. A single scholar may spend a career translating a few hundred tablets out of a corpus of 500,000. The afterlife material, scattered across collections on 3 continents, and often catalogued under broad categories like religious text or funerary literature, has never been systematically compiled, cross-referenced, or analysed as a unified body of evidence. This is not suppression in the conspiratorial sense. No one locks the tablets away to hide what they say. The mechanism is simpler, and in some ways more effective. Neglect. The oldest written account of what happens after death sits in climate-controlled storage in a dozen institutions, on fragments that could be read by the 500 or so people on Earth who possess the necessary linguistic training, and it remains unread not because it is forbidden, but because no one has been paid to read it. The most consequential silence is not the one enforced by authority, it is the one produced by indifference. The Sumerians did not treat death as a mystery to be solved, they treated it as a system to be managed. Their funerary rites were not expressions of grief, they were engineering. The offerings of bread and water left at gravesides were not symbolic, they were operational. The recitation of the dead person's name was not sentimental, it was functional. A maintenance protocol for a spirit that required ongoing support to remain stable on the other side of a boundary the living could not see, but whose consequences they documented exhaustively. Every ritual, every offering, every prayer directed at the Gidim was built on the premise that the first moments after death determined the trajectory of what came next, and that trajectory could be influenced by the living if they acted correctly and in time. 4,000 years later, in hospitals equipped with technology the scribes of Nippur could not have imagined, doctors record the same window, the minutes after cardiac arrest, the interval in which something measurable persists, the brief period in which the boundary between alive and dead is not a line but a corridor, and what happens inside that corridor is described by those who return in terms that would not have surprised an old Babylonian scribe holding a reed stylus over wet clay. Every person listening to this will die. That is not a metaphor. It is the single fact about the future that carries no uncertainty. The question the Sumerians carved into clay, what happens in the first minutes after the body stops, is not an ancient question. It is the most current question any living person can ask. And the oldest written answer, pressed into tablets the size of a hand in a language almost no one alive can read, is sitting right in now, in a museum basement, under a catalogue number, in a drawer that has not been opened this year, waiting for the funding, the scholar, and the will to unseal it. The dead in Sumerian theology do not stop waiting, neither does the clay that holds their account.